So next, I just want to welcome Nida. She's from our Palestinian community here in Cork. We're so grateful to have her. We're so grateful to have her to lead this conversation, and we are so grateful that she is doing this for us. We're under no illusions how difficult this time is for anyone who's Palestinian, how heartbreaking and how painful it is. So please give her a warm welcome. She will be introducing our guest of the evening, Daniel Matè.
Hello everyone, thank you for attending and being part of this conversation with Daniel. I would also like to thank Cork Palestine Solidarity Campaign for organizing this event, but also for constantly working to center Palestinian voices. And of course, a big thank you to Daniel for devoting his time to be with us tonight. So before we start our conversation, I'd like to introduce myself. I am Nida, a Palestinian from the West Bank. I lived most of my life in the West Bank. I only came to Ireland 3 years ago to pursue my PhD in international law and human rights. As a Palestinian from the West Bank, I am part of the collective that witnessed the direct violence of the occupation, including daily raids, killing and assassination of innocent people and children, the administrative detention, the humiliation and the harassment at checkpoints, and of course the ongoing and growing illegal settlements and land theft. So all these can be defined or can contribute to what can be defined as the collective trauma of Palestinians. When I left Palestine to Lebanon to pursue my master's studies, I was introduced to a different layer of the colonial oppression. I was told stories of the difficult living conditions of Palestinians in refugee camps. And I was told stories of the massacres and genocides against our people in those camps. The massacres and genocides like Sabra and Shatila and Tel el-Zatar massacres, they were committed by Israel, whether directly or indirectly through its support and motivation. And I also met people from Gaza who told me an even worse version of the colonial oppression, culminated in the siege that started 17 years ago and still ongoing. But also the continued and the repeated military aggression on the Gaza Strip. So we Palestinians, regardless where we are due to this colonial division, they divided us and divided our sufferings, but still we have our share of trauma. This trauma is inadequately addressed, and that is mainly because it is an ongoing trauma. It is our living reality. But also because conversations around trauma are restricted to certain circles of academics and experts in the field. You don't hear Palestinians talking about their trauma in day-to-day activities or in day-to-day. So today we are witnessing a live stream genocide. This genocide and what we're seeing and witnessing triggers our known and unknown layers of trauma. So trauma will definitely be at the heart of our conversation tonight. So I hope that it will be an interesting conversation, a fruitful one, and that all of you get to be part of it. Moving to Daniel, Mahmoud Darwish, a Palestinian poet, says, "I don't define myself, lest I lose myself. And you, Daniel, you are many things. You are a musical composer, lyricist, a mental chiropractor, and the co-author of the book The Myth of Normal. But also, you are a former Zionist. So can you tell us about the book and a bit about your journey and how you unlearned Zionism? First, please welcome on the stage.
Well, thank you, Nita. I have to say, I wasn't prepared for that because you told me at the back that you're not so much of a public speaker. And so now I'm wondering what else you're not telling the truth about. Because that was just extraordinary. Thank you for that. Can you repeat the question?
Okay, so can you tell us about the book, The Myth of Normal, and maybe about your journey and how you unlearned Zionism?
I'm going to have to do one or the other, and then those are two completely...
Okay, start with the book, maybe.
The book?
Yeah.
Sure. So, yeah, The Myth of Normal is what I was speaking about here at an event yesterday for psychotherapists. And I'm the co-author of it, and I'm the small font author of it, co-author of it. So if you look on the... Anyone here read the book? Yeah. Not nearly enough. Shame on yous. That's fine, you got plenty of time. The paperback is about to come out here on this side of the world. I co-wrote it with my dad, and he was the prime motor of the book, and it's his book, fundamentally. He had been trying to write it for 5 or 6 years when I came aboard, and in many ways it's sort of his magnum opus. It's the culmination of much of his, well, all of his work, really, looking at the effects of the environment, of trauma, of adversity, of stress on our physical and mental health, and he had focused on this condition and that affliction and various sort of specific instances of it. But this book, the idea was to zoom out all the way to the society we're living in. The original title, which was much less catchy, was Toxic Culture, How Capitalism Makes Us Sick. And we had to kind of shake him out of that one. And yeah, sometime around 2018, he realized he needed some help with it. He actually shared the book proposal he had written, which my mom had called, I believe the review exactly was, leaden and unreadable. And she wasn't far off. It wasn't unreadable, but it was heavy because the material is heavy, and it's just a lot for one person. And I took a look at it and I said, Dad, I've edited your stuff in the past, and this time I know I can help you get this book to what it needs to be, but I'm going to have to come out from behind the curtain. I'm actually going to have to be your co-writer. And he said, I was hoping you would say that. So we started working together on it, and it came out in 2022. And just in a nutshell, the premise of the book is that we're living in a world where normality is assumed to be natural and healthy. And in fact, in a society such as ours, to be normal is in many ways evidence of deep dysfunction, because the normal that our society defines as normal is really at odds with how human beings are designed, what we need, who we're meant to be, really, or at least it's a very constrained version of it. And it makes sense. You have a society based on the premise that human beings are discrete individuals who can be understood separately from each other, that the mind and the body are separate, that the pursuit of profit and acquisition equals the pursuit of happiness. These completely go against the way human beings evolved. And if you were to look at an hour on a clock as the entire span of our species, we've only lived outside of small band hunter-gatherer groups for the last 6 minutes or so. So we are the aberration, we are the experiment in all kinds of variables that are unprecedented, and the book is about how the health crises that we're facing, whether it's physical illness, autoimmune disease, cancer, chronic illness, mental illnesses of all kinds, and addiction, are natural and normal responses to a completely unnatural environment, you know? And so the book takes a look at the science that, you know, that behind all that, that's not taught in medical schools, even though it's been published in medical journals. And then we expand the lens to the family, to childbirth, to pregnancy, and then to the economy, to the way our society is set up in terms of who has not. And we even look at the realm of politics, about how we seem to be a world that elects the most fucked up people and elevates them to the highest levels of power, invests in them a whole lot of emotional investment, which only feeds their woundedness, and then they enact policies that create more wounds for all of us, and it's just a big cycle. And then the last part of the book is about healing. The subtitle of the book is Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. And although I think the UK publishers might have brightened that subtitle slightly for the paperback version. They want to get the beach reading crowd. Oh, what you reading, love? Oh, it's about trauma, illness, and healing. I just went from an English to an Irish accent in one sentence. I'm doing it again. This is terrible. Stop it. Don't do that here. So that's the book. My contribution to it was, I'd say, modest, but mandatory. In terms of the content of the book, my dad had done much of the research, done all the interviews, and it's based on his work. But in terms of getting the thing written, the style of the book, my mandate was tighter, lighter, and brighter. Just get it readable and get it fun to the extent possible. And also try to make it persuasive for people who aren't already aboard the trauma train, people who aren't already sort of in the Gabor world. And I like what we came up with. It was a great collaboration with someone that, if you'd told me when I was a kid that I'd get to do that with him, I think I would have been pretty into it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. So this is your sign. If you haven't read the book yet, please go grab it.
Yeah, or the audiobook narrated by me.
Right. Right. So can you then tell us about your journey in unlearning Zionism?
Yeah, well, it's funny. So when Nita at the back asked me, is it okay if I introduce you as a former Zionist? I was quick to be like, well, you could, but actually technically I was a former Zionist youth group member. Oh, and actually I was a former Zionist youth group leader. And I wanted to somehow, I was trying to distance myself from it. But I always say that, Zionism is as Zionism does. I mean, the distancing thing is my way of saying I never fully bought in, and I really never did. But that doesn't mean I wasn't ensconced in it. I didn't speak the words. I didn't participate in educational programs that taught kids to see things a certain way. Even if I knew better or I had misgivings, which I did from the very beginning. So yeah, functionally, in terms of as a party, how would I feel if someone's like, yeah, I was a Nazi youth leader, and I always felt complicated about it. It was a nuanced thing for me, and we're not supposed to compare, but analogies are fun. But it was I will say this, I was inoculated against fully believing in it by virtue of having an anti-Zionist father who sent me to a Zionist summer camp. Figure that one out. So to sort of understand my journey, I have to sort of recapitulate my dad's, which, he spoke about many times publicly, but, he came to Canada as a 13-year-old immigrant after the Hungarian Revolution. He had been a proud little communist in Hungary after World War II, where he almost died at the hands of the Nazis. And of course, the Soviet Union's the one who saved his life. So he was, Stalin was his hero, and he would pledge allegiance to Stalin in school assemblies. And then, 1956, Russian troops roll into Budapest and are murdering students and crushing the revolution, and his illusions are shattered. Comes to Canada. Now Canada and the US are the shining city on the hill, beacons of democracy. Then Vietnam happens, and by this point he's in high school, going into university. He starts finding out what's really going on there, and now that illusion is shattered. And meanwhile, there's plucky little Israel. This is around the time of 1967, which, by all media accounts, by the popular narrative, was standing up for its right to exist against, 7 or 5 or however many it was, hostile Arab armies, and against the odds, and a kind of David and Goliath story, beating them soundly in 6 or 7 days. 6 days, that's the famous number of days, 6. And of course we know now that the State Department knew full well that Israel had they were not really under threat. The assessment never was that they were the underdog, but that's the story he was told. But after the debacle of Vietnam, he started asking himself, well, the media that told me that we were spreading democracy in Vietnam was hiding all this stuff from me. What are they hiding in this case? So as a university student, he started, reading into it, and he sort of, that's when he realized that there had been another people there. And you're just not told that. In fact, you're told the opposite. The classic Zionist bedtime story is a land without people for a people without a land. It's not even a land without a people. They say a land without people. And that, again, once my dad sees something he can't unsee, the door swings one way and he was on the other side. And from then he was a dissident Jew in the Vancouver and Canadian Jewish communities. So by the time I was coming of age, it was, 1986, 87, the start of the first Intifada. And it was near the time that I was starting to prepare for my bar mitzvah as well. And I think the first time I remember running into his politics, because he never really talked about it until the Intifada. But I was at Hebrew school studying for my bar mitzvah, and in Sunday school, Hebrew school, there's a lot of content that wasn't just scripture and, liturgy and all that. There was political stuff, and our Hebrew school teacher would show us the big map of how tiny Israel is and how big the Arab countries are and how many countries the Arabs, we didn't call them Palestinians back then, just the Arabs, have to go to if only the Arabs would accept them or accept Israel, and Israel wants peace. We played a board game once where I remember landing on a certain square. You pull the card and it says, you talk to the PLO, go back 3 spaces.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah.
Wow.
Land for peace was anathema. And this is in the sort of right-wing mainstream of the Vancouver Jewish community. And I had our rabbi, who would have been socially progressive, probably, or liberal at least, on everything else, pull me aside and say, your father is a great man, he does great medical work, but he's basically an enemy of our people and you shouldn't listen to him on politics. He didn't quite use those language, but that was the message. Meanwhile, there was summer camp. And summer camp was on a tiny, idyllic Gulf island near Vancouver called Gabriola Island, and the camp was called Camp Miriam. And it was part of a larger youth group that was North America-wide, affiliated with a worldwide movement called Habonim, or Habonim Dror. And that literally means the builders of freedom. And it was affiliated with the kibbutz movement in Israel, the socialist, or putatively socialist movement to create communes, and all Jewish communes, but still, and to have a kind of worker Judaism, a kind of self-sufficient Judaism, and working the land and getting back to the land, which was a big focus of some of the European Zionists. They were tired of being studious, intellectual victims. They wanted to be rugged and self-sufficient. There was something appealing about that as far as an identity goes. So these summer camps were modeled on the kibbutz model, meaning that we would do all of our own work. We didn't have a serving staff like these other fancy camps that the other Jewish kids went to. where you'd have staff serving you your meals and all this stuff. No, we served each other our meals. We had work groups. We cleaned our toilets. We took the garbage out. We did laundry for each other, and we would make up songs and skits to advertise our work group. And there was just this pride in kind of owning our own camp and like being our own community. And we would have a communal fund that we put money into and then decide by consensus, okay, what are we going to spend it on? Candy, a movie, a field trip, go bowling, and we'd have votes and discussions. So it was participatory. And this for me was a home away from home. In fact, it was a home better than home in many ways. Certainly better than school, where I was one of the only Jewish kids. Here I was surrounded by Jewish kids. And I wasn't a weirdo, because everyone was weird. It was very hippie. We'd have counselors that would teach us, we'd learn songs on big butcher paper, like big songs with the lyrics, and they'd hold it up, and someone would have the guitar and teach it. I remember we used to sing "Friend of the Devil" by the Grateful Dead, like a camp full of kids, like from 8 to 16, singing, "Got a wife in Chino, babe, and one in Tennessee." First one says she's got my child, but you don't look like me. It was that kind of thing. It was very irreverent and fun and playful and theatrical. I think my love of musical theater started there. So that's why my anti-Zionist father sent me there. He also sent me there because it kind of ran in the family. We were sort of a big deal family there. Not quite royalty, but sort of. Both my uncles had been camp director. My dad had been a lifeguard there back in his Zionist days. And I guess he felt that it was a relatively innocuous place to send your kids to get some Jewish community and to have a positive summer camp experience. And I dare say, there probably wouldn't have been a better summer camp in British Columbia to send us to. It was really excellent. And we also learned about social justice, feminism, environmentalism. It was very, very left-wing. It was progressive, except for Palestine. And yet it was even progressive on Palestine compared to other Zionist environments. We had counselors who were members of Shalom Achshav, Peace Now, which at the time was, they were the ones who organized the anti-Lebanon war protests in Tel Aviv and had hundreds of thousands of people out in Tel Aviv back when Israel had a sane sector of its society protesting its government's policies on moral grounds, not just on self-interest grounds. So there was some strong, and we would learn about the occupation from certain counselors, not from others. We had Israeli counselors who had just gotten out of the army, and they tended to be more stoic and defensive about, we do what we need to do, and if they wanted peace, we would not have to, so on and so forth. But we got a variety of views within certain bounds, right? Now, how did I grow out of it? Well, like I said, I never fully bought in, and I had my father at home being an example of someone who was way outside of that, outside of those goalposts. So he went to the West Bank during the first Intifada on a medical tour, and I remember he was interviewed by CBC National Radio. From Hebron or Ramallah or something. And I remember he was weeping on national radio. I've never heard my dad cry before. Certainly never seen it. But he said he'd been crying every day since he got there, seeing Palestinian teenagers with their skulls split open and seeing the brutality of the occupation. And then I saw how the Jewish community tried to boycott and censor him, how his voice was absolutely the last thing they wanted to allow. And there was one incident in particular that I remember when he was invited by CBC television in Vancouver to sit on a panel, basically do a debate, kind of 3 against 3. One side of the room, the head of the Canadian Jewish Congress and 2 other mainstream functionaries of Zionist Jewish organizations, maybe a rabbi's in the mix. On the other side, a Palestinian scholar, another Arab activist from some other country, and my father. And when he received this invitation, my dad said to the television producer, "Look, I'll say yes, but on one caveat. I've had this happen before, and what's going to happen is they're going to tell you that they're not going to debate if I'm on the panel. And they said, "Oh, don't worry, Dr. Matè. We've dealt with that before. We'll hold the line. We're absolutely committed to your participation." And lo and behold, 3 or 4 days before the event, he gets a call and says, "I'm sorry, Dr. Matè, but the entire Zionist side of the debate threatened to pull out. If you're included, we'd like to offer you a front row seat and a special, like, you get to ask a question, like we'll give you a featured question from the audience." And I'm kind of surprised in retrospect that he agreed to that, but he did. And they replaced him with some hapless Arab, like, no offense to this person, but it was token, they were trying to, again, the Jewish community, the Zionist community could not afford to show the world that these things do not fall along Jewish Arab lines, but along wrong lines, right? Because it would expose the lies at the center of their ideology. So I just remember being in the studio audience watching this debate, and it was unbearably stiff and boring and difficult. People talking past each other, and I was wishing my dad was on stage. And then finally it's time for his question, and he's tense and he's angry, and he asks the question, and the person, he gets gaslit by the Zionists who call him a self-hater or something like that, and he starts yelling at them, and the host is like, "We have to go to commercial," and like we go to commercial as my dad is yelling at the stage. And that was my introduction really to the whole Jewish Zionist world. And something clicked in me. I'm like, if these are the tactics they have to resort to, they can't be right. They can't be right. They're crazy. Or at least they're really dishonest. I mean, I just saw the nastiness of it, So back to summer camp, at least summer camp felt better than that. There was debate, there was singing, I was always uncomfortable with the nationalism, with raising the Israeli flag, which we did every day, but on Fridays, for Shabbat, we would actually sing the Israeli national anthem once a week. And something in me never liked it. I didn't love singing the Canadian national anthem either. I don't like national anthems, but in particular, there's something about the Israeli national anthem, which is this very sad dirge. It starts with this minor scale, and it sings about, and they would teach us the meaning of the words. The Jewish soul yearns for home, and are the hope of 2,000 years, and this and that. And something felt ominous to me. Something felt manipulative to me. And that was the feeling I had throughout my youth when I went to this camp, that I'm being manipulated somehow. My emotions are being played on, and I'm not being told the whole truth. And this is before I'd ever heard the word Nakba. So that, I'm getting into maybe more detail than your question.
You're doing great.
Yeah.
So,
But I mean, the journey out came when I became a counselor, finally. So do you want me to just tell you that part of it, or do you want to ask another question?
I do have
Yeah, you got
plenty
a
of questions, so maybe we can jump.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so what do you have to say on the treatment of this genocide as a continuation of the Holocaust trauma and the comparison between the two genocides? I just made fun of that.
Yeah. It's true and it's not true. It's appropriate and it's not appropriate. I'm tired of it. I'm just tired of it. Let the Holocaust be the Holocaust. And let this be this. And yet they are connected. So we have to talk about it, I guess. But I think we all are feeling a certain amount of fatigue. Because we can't just talk about this. We have to bring in so many other things that... I mean, look, the Palestinian people should not have to answer for the Holocaust, number one. From the perspective of a Palestinian, I would understand if someone never wanted to hear that capitalized word again. Because what's happening now is a Holocaust, small h. It just is. The definition of the word is a ritual sacrifice. And the Palestinians it's a blood sacrifice to satisfy the heathen gods of a country that only pretends to be monotheistic, that only pretends to believe in the one true, law of the universe, but in fact worships power and security and ethnic purity and other things that have led other cultures down the road to ruin throughout history. I am the grandson and son of Holocaust survivors. I am the great-grandson of Holocaust victims. My great-grandparents died in Auschwitz. I think it's only partly true that Israel's insanity is a function of Holocaust trauma. You might call it Holocaust psychosis, because the topic of the Holocaust is drilled into Israeli children from a young age, and they're all flown over to Poland to drape themselves hugging each other in the Israeli flag as they cry over a history they know very little about, and they're told an only small part of. Now, again, here's another sort of I got the best of it because I lived in Israel for 10 months on a kibbutz sent by this youth group. It was like, they're selling this program to you from the time you're small. After high school, you go live on a kibbutz for 10 months. And during that, in the middle, and we were living very near Gaza, actually. We knew very little about what was happening, only 20 kilometers from us. But in the middle of that year, there was an optional trip to Poland. But it wasn't like the March of the Living or Birthright trips, because we were already in Israel, so we'd already kind of, the shine had already been, we were living just in the country, it was like a place. And it was full of, we weren't idealizing it anymore. We knew Israelis. We knew some of them were pricks. We knew some of them were great. We had a sense of the tensions inside the culture. And from there, we went to Poland. And I remember we had a tour guide who was a Holocaust survivor, and most of the week was about how Jews lived in relative peace and harmony with Polish people for about 1,000 years. That was the main thrust of the trip. And then we went to the death camps. So it was rather well-rounded, but that's not what Israeli kids get. Israeli kids get terrorized into a fascist ideology. So it's hand-me-down trauma, distorted, pickled, fermented, and turned into a very toxic thing that then justifies whatever. So that's not the Holocaust. That's the bastardization of the Holocaust. That's the exploitation of the Holocaust. That's the weaponization of the Holocaust. That's got nothing to do with the Holocaust itself. And Norman Finkelstein wrote the book, The Holocaust Industry, 20 years ago now. Very on point, as always ahead of the curve, that guy. So, and here's the other fact. Israel was created 3 years after World War II ended. Zionism started 60 years before that as a political project. And there was no inkling of the Holocaust. Maybe there was an inkling of bad things coming in Europe, and certainly pogroms were happening. Jews were not safe in many places. The persecution was real, and the trauma of that was real, and the insecurity was real. But the Holocaust was not the main driver of most of those waves of immigration up to that point. It just accelerated the game, and the Zionists exploited it very cynically and very craftily, So, and then you've got the fact, and this never gets talked about, that it was the European Jews, in large part, who suffered the Holocaust. But that's not the only Jews in the world, and it's certainly not the only Jews in Israel. You've got the Mizrahi Jews, or the Jews of the East, or the Sephardic Jews, or whatever you want to call them, right? And they themselves are an oppressed, exploited, and weaponized minority, because they've turned into much of Netanyahu's base. But what happened to them? How did they get to Israel? Well, it's a whole story I still don't know enough about. I'm still learning about it, but they, like the Jews of Poland, had lived in other societies. Not even other societies. It was just theirs. They were Arab Jews. There were, Arab Christians, Arab Muslims, and Arab Jews, and they all lived in relative congruence, with, of course, some flare-ups of this and that. But the Jews of Morocco, the Jews of Syria, the Jews of Iraq, these were all well integrated into the society. And then Israel came along and everything changed. And Israel exploited the unrest that was there and did a lot to foment a lot of insecurity in those places and to impel Jews to emigrate to a place they had never wanted to go, and then treated them horribly. The Yemeni Jews were sprayed with pesticides. There was sterilizations, and they were told that they were dirty Arabs and they needed to become Israelis. And the Israelification of the Mizrahi Jews is another kind of trauma that's got nothing to do with the Holocaust. So yeah, you're talking about a people, the Israeli people, that is deeply traumatized, but it's not traumatized just by the gas chambers and the Nazis. It's traumatized by the consequences of the choices of the Zionist movement and by the fundamental wrong-headedness of the idea that the Jews can't belong anywhere, therefore we need to go create a place where only we belong. And you see Israelis talking about how we're indigenous to this land. They don't act like indigenous people. They're there, but they're not there. And they hate the Palestinians, I think, because the Palestinians do belong there. They actually have that sense of belonging. In the Zionist idea, this land is ours. God gave this land to us. The land belongs to us. In the indigenous idea, which every Palestinian I know seems to embody, we belong to the land.
Right. Okay, so I think you mentioned the exploitation of the Holocaust trauma and what Israel is doing. So with all what's going on in Gaza, there is this tendency to undermine and avoid conversations about trauma and mental health, especially among Palestinians.
Yeah.
In fact, many people look at such topics with cynicism, the same way in which they view human rights. Why do you think there is this kind of cynicism, and why it is important to not dismiss the impact of this genocide on the collectivity of the Palestinians? Where could this lead if not being dealt with?
Can you say more about the cynicism? Who's cynical?
All right, so for example, human rights, the discourse of human rights in Palestine, among Palestinians, it's dealt with cynicism.
Understandably.
Yeah, because you make fun of human rights and the whole discourse because it's not our reality. It's not applied.
Right.
Yeah, and even the talk about trauma, when this genocide started, I've seen many posts on social media asking Palestinians to not talk about their feelings.
From other Palestinians?
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Because this is not the right time to talk about your feelings. You have to process them on your own. Mm-hmm. But to talk about this, the trauma and the mental health is comes with privilege, comes with luxury. You are safe enough to think about processing
it's
your feelings.
Yeah, self-indulgent, and I got it. Well, first of all, I understand the impatience with self-help talk in the political sphere when there's a crisis. I get it, because especially on Instagram, that traffics in cheap emotions and self-absorption sold as, I don't know what. But that itself, I think, is a kind of trauma response. So we should define trauma, Trauma, as we define it in the myth of normal, isn't the events that happen to you. It's not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. It's the lasting impact. So, would a rugby metaphor work in this crowd? I usually give a hockey metaphor. It's not the illegal... Are there illegal tackles in rugby? It's not...
GAA.
There are... Is that?
GAA. GAA.
GAA?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not the GAA, it's the concussion. called that because the person yells, "Gah!" So it's the inner rupture or fracture or discombobulation that lasts over time. We lose touch with part of ourselves. We split inside ourselves. We conclude, either cognitively or just on the somatic level, that some of our feelings are just too dangerous to feel. And of course, on the level of physical trauma, brain damage, certain circuits get disrupted, and then we have triggers thereafter, where before the same stimulus would have provoked a mild response if we'd even noticed it, then suddenly the same stimulus provokes an overwhelming and disproportionate reaction. So trauma is what we're carrying inside us. I can't tell anyone else how to deal with their trauma. I'm not a trauma evangelist. I might be related to one, but I'm not one. No one can prescribe healing to anyone else. And part of being traumatized is that it can be too painful to talk about the trauma for some time. You're just not ready for it. And in this moment, when there's an emergency going on, to some people, any talk of feelings or self-care or whatever, especially those of people who are not there, might seem cruel, or at the very least beside the point. So I don't begrudge anyone their resistance to it. At the same time, why deal with trauma? Because that's what you're asking. What are the upsides to dealing with trauma? Well, trauma constricts our view of the world. Trauma wreaks havoc on our nervous systems. Trauma can kill us if we don't, if it festers, it can turn into all kinds of things. We can go, for lack of a better word, crazy. We can lose touch with reality. We can be impelled to react in ways that could put us in danger or other people in danger. We can get sick if we suppress our trauma. People who always think positively and never get angry, these are the ones who tend to seem to get many chronic illnesses. The reasons for that are explained in the book. So, as a personal choice, a person chooses to address their trauma when not addressing it becomes too disastrous, when life says, okay, it's time to actually face this. And I think many people who react like you're describing are just, they just can't right now. And that's fine. But also, I think they're afraid, these people, I think there's a fear of feeling. And I think it takes the form of, if I let myself feel, it's going to dull my edge. I haven't seen the cynicism from Palestinians towards each other about trauma. I have seen a lot of cynicism about, why are we still talking about Jewish trauma? Why are we talking about Israeli trauma? Now that I have even more sympathy for. We're supposed to sympathize with our oppressors right now while they're doing this. And yet what I say to them is, it sounds like you think that if you recognize someone else's trauma, you're going to develop this thing called compassion for them, and that if you develop compassion for them, you can't oppose them with every fiber of your being, which is exactly what you need to do. And I'm just not sure that's true. I did a book review on Instagram recently of a book called The Lover by Rebecca Sachs that depicts Israeli society in a way that's very disturbing. And one of the things that makes it disturbing is that she understands what makes them tick and where this behavior is coming from. And you get to the point where you can kind of get inside their heads, which is what good art should do, I think. Allow us to understand the ununderstandable. And at the end of it, you're still horrified by this society, and you're like, this is not going anywhere good, and this needs to be opposed and defeated, but you have some insight into what's going on over there. So that doesn't strike me as counter to a political movement. As for why Palestinians should be speaking about their trauma, everyone should have the right to speak about their trauma if they want. Anyone else should have the right not to listen if they don't want to listen. I'm sick and tired of people on social media telling other people what to say or not to say and calling that political activism. That's not activism. That's gatekeeping or tone policing or any of these other stupid online terms. It's just making yourself feel better in a time when feeling better is just not what's for dinner. You know, and it gives people a false sense, I think, of agency. Oh, if I can't tear down the Zionist oppressors, maybe I could tear down this fake ally, or maybe I could tell this Palestinian to stop being a normalizer, or so on and so forth, and I'll feel radical and I'll feel good. There's kind of a hit of whatever, and I understand that too. I have compassion for it. But my God, people are, I mean, some of the most radical and effective Palestinian influencers, another term I hate, but I've somehow become one, against my will. Some of the strongest voices are the ones who are also able to bring some vulnerability. You know, you look at someone like Janan, you know, not a softie at all, politically, doesn't give an inch on, you know, this. That's exactly right. I mean, she said it, she meant it, she's here to represent it, as we used to chant at summer camp. It's a good rhyme, man. There's a lot of good stuff. I have to write a musical someday, but I can't. I was Seth Rogen's camp counselor, by the way, there. I used to sit on his head to wake him up in the morning. He was a very sleepy boy. But, so Janan is politically unsparing. And Janan will also show you her tears and speak about not knowing what to do. And, I don't know, doesn't seem to be hurting the cause, you know? So I think if people are uncomfortable with trauma talk, it's just because they're carrying stuff they're not ready to look at, and that's fine. That's their business.
So you don't agree with the connection made between talking about trauma and being privileged? There is nothing to do about privilege.
I don't like privilege talk, period. I'm sick and tired of the word privilege. I understand what it's pointing to, but it's one of these, to me it sounds like the word original, it's like original sin. You have this thing inside of you that you're supposed to somehow expiate, like get it out of me. I can't, I was born with it. Well, I need to acknowledge it and confess it and so on and so forth. It takes on a ritual quality of self-flagellation that I don't know that it actually does anything to change a person's viewpoint or get them into more action, and then it acts as a cudgel to tell other people to shut up because they... The word I use, and I was told recently that this is an ableist term, but I'm going to use it anyway because and trust that people know where I'm coming from here. Blind spots. It's just the best term I know for it. So I apologize if that term lands wrong for anyone. We all have blind spots, and those of us with more privilege have more blind spots. You know, like I went to jail in Mexico City for 3.5 weeks. Not on a visit. I was not on a fact-finding mission. I guess I was kind. I overstayed my tourist visa. And I was the only gringo in there, out of 600 men. And they were packing them in there. It was over capacity. And when I got out, I did some research on the facility, and it turns out that like a Guatemalan 8-year-old girl had died there, maybe in one of the beds that I was sleeping in when she rolled out of bed and hit the floor. And I was the only white guy in there. They called me Canada. That was my name. Canada. And my privilege certainly got exposed to me. But it was just that my privilege was that I'd gotten to go through the world with certain blind spots unchallenged and intact. Like my life was a series of invisible guardrails that kept me from falling into the reality of most of the world. The reality of most of the world that's suffering at the hands of the society that privileges me. And I got to see that. And now I can't unsee that. I still have the privilege. It's worth acknowledging, especially in like a kind of gratitude practice kind of way, what there is to be grateful for. But I don't like any term that shuts people down and gets them into a guilty, shameful place. I've never seen guilt and shame be a very effective motivator of effective change. So when people use privilege to shut people up talking about trauma, no. I think that's in bad taste. To tell a Palestinian person anywhere in the world right now who's expressing themselves, trying to keep themselves sane by any means, including telling whoever will listen how much pain they're in, telling them that that's privilege. I think it's privilege to tell someone else that they have privilege in that case. What are you doing with your privilege? You know? And it's not my place to tell anyone else, especially in the Palestinian community, what to do or how to react to each other, but that's sitting on the outside with all the benefits and the drawbacks of being on the outside. Because privilege gives us advantages and it gives us disadvantages. I have a perspective that you don't, but there's a whole lot of perspectives you have that I can't have, and I have to be humble about that.
Nice. All right, so being a Jewish in the US,
I haven't gotten a single applause line. Am I just not that kind of speaker? You know, it's more like because I hear a lot of murmuring and like, I kind of like that. You know, like, every once in a while I want to say something that makes people like go, yeah!
We're nodding respectfully. Doing a lot of nodding.
They do that at the UN too. No, but I feel your hearts, which is the difference.
okay, so being a Jewish in the US, how does this genocide impact the sense of belonging to the Jewish community and how it shapes their activism? To put it in context, I've seen a video on social media of a Jewish girl in the US. She was crying and saying that I can't, every time I see a Jewish person, I have this feeling of not belonging, but also feeling ashamed somehow, and doubting and thinking and like wondering if this person is Zionist, if he's like agreeing with what Israel is carrying in Gaza. And so
Yeah. Well, you know, I sort of pieced out of the Jewish community a long time ago. I'm not a community guy. I like to be on my own, listening to my records and being unique and weird and an artist. I'm just such an individual. I don't need communities. Or so I tell myself. Or so I tell my therapist. But it's true, ever since I left the Jewish youth group, and maybe I'll tell you one story at some point tonight about the last thing I did there. Maybe we can end with that, because I think it might be a good bookend. But anyway, that was 20 years ago. I have not been involved in anything Jewish, except once I was in a play, a musical that was put on by a group of anti-Zionist Jews, including some anti-Zionist Israelis, called An Olive on the Seder Plate, which is a tradition that progressive Jews have included now in the Passover Seder. You know, the Passover Seder has all the different food items that have different symbolic meanings, and some people include an orange as a statement of feminism, which is a story behind that. But now a lot of progressive Jews for the past, 15 years have been including an olive to bring the Palestinian struggle into the conversation. And that's been happening in some progressive homes for a while. So we did a play called An Olive on the Seder Plate, and it was about Jewish perspectives on Zionism. But I haven't been involved. But it's still very painful. I was at a cafe in a Jewish neighborhood very, very close to me, actually. I don't live in Crown Heights. I live in Bedford-Stuyvesant. But if you cross Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, you're in Crown Heights, which is an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. And I was in there and surrounded by Jews, and I had this tension in me. I was listening for. I could just feel the Zionism in the room, you know. It's a vibe. It's a whole mood, as the kids say. And yeah, sure enough, next to the door there was a sign saying, fellow Jews, let's light an extra Shabbat candle for the Israeli people right now in this time and cheer them on to victory or safety or whatever. It's hard to see. And it's why I don't go to places like that very much. And I think for a lot of young Jews who thought they belonged, see, I had the advantage of the rabbi breaking my illusions when I was 12 by trying to get me to hate my father. Fuck you. I don't want to be part of this community. If you're the leader of it, fuck off. It was more heartbreaking for me to realize that even the best people in my left-wing Zionist circle were deeply deluded. And it's painful to have illusions shattered. I'm always quoting Axl Rose from Guns N' Roses. There's a lyric where he says, I've worked too hard for my illusions just to throw them all away. I like that. And, but you know what? There's never been a better time to be an anti-Zionist Jew, I tell you. Boy, oh boy. These are the good old days. No, really, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, within the day, October 8th, I recorded my first walk and talk on Instagram, which started this whole thing. And then I think that night I went to Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn near Prospect Park, and there was a Jewish Voice for Peace rally, and people kept coming and coming. They just knew that we had to be together. And there were rabbis speaking there, and I remember one speaker was screaming, there's a genocide coming. We need to stop. I mean, the bombing had barely even started. They were just listening to what Israeli leaders were saying. What Yoav Gallant said about no food, no water, no electricity. And then we marched over to Chuck Schumer's apartment, which was a few blocks away, and asked to use the toilet. No, he wasn't home. He wasn't home, but that's new. And then they shut down Grand Central Station a couple of weeks later. And they went to the Statue of Liberty. And they've been shutting down the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan Bridge. And this is happening all over the country. Again, I'll quote Prophet Norm. He wrote a book called Knowing Too Much, The Coming American Jewish Breakup with Israel. He wrote this in 2008 or 9, basically making the point that when you get down to it, Jews are liberal, at least young Jews. We believe in civil rights, we believe in progressive causes. You can't square that with supporting this country. It used to be the case when I was growing up that you could tell yourself, well, there's an Israeli left wing and someday they will prevail. You had politicians like Yossi Sarid and Shulamit Aloni of the Meretz party who were, former communists and allied with Palestinians, and you had Palestinians in the Knesset who actually had a voice. And there was a sense of a peace movement. But by the time the Second Intifada rolled around, that killed it because they sold the Israeli public a bill of goods about Oslo, peace is coming. And of course it was never going to bring peace. It was all process, no peace, as Edward Said said. And then when the Palestinians reacted rationally with protests to Ariel Sharon's provocations in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were, the dam finally burst, the frustrations erupted, there were suicide bomb attacks, there were all kinds of horrible things, and Israelis gave up on peace. Many of them, and the Israeli left started to evaporate, and now we have what we have now. So, I forget where I was going with that, but in terms of North American and worldwide Jewish anti-Zionism, at least there's a place for that woman to go now. There wouldn't have been when I was growing up. You know, the farthest left you could get was when I was at McGill University. We had a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group. We met every Saturday or something at someone's apartment. We'd sit and we would politely debate, and then we would not so politely debate because everyone would just get so frustrated. Primarily the Palestinians, because what are they doing there? Trying to convince a bunch of like left-wing Jews who are trying to hang on to their Zionism at all costs. It's like, we want to be your friends, we want to understand you, we want to see you as human beings. Just let us keep our attachment to the Jewish state, please. Don't invalidate our national identity, which means don't make us fully reckon with what happened to you, with what this national identity caused for you, which means don't be a full human. So let me like you and get myself some virtue points by being in some kind of superficial relationship with you, but don't make me deal with your history. But you're going to have to deal with mine. And that was the outer limit of things then, and it's very, very different now. So, yeah. Ty, thanks for kicking off the applause that time.
I got you.
Ty, thank you, everyone.
Okay, so this is a complex question that runs through the minds of many people in Gaza. We all know that in this live stream genocide, people from all over the world are exposed to daily horrors and traumatizing scenes, such as the Flower Massacre and recently Shifa Hospital massacres. And if we look back at history, we can see that traumatizing events, such as the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and 9/11, were utilized to justify and support military campaigns. There was a sense that an action is needed to take place. Why is this absent in the case of Palestine? Is this urgency to act upon trauma selective?
Yeah, of course it's selective. And the selection process is, what do the powers that be want? I mean, what are the political imperatives when you have the world's biggest empire and arms supplier be Israel's best friend, and you have the entire West afraid to upset the Godfather? That's when the vaunted commitment to spreading democracy and the responsibility to protect, remember that one, the R2P? That's the pretext for, I think, the bombing of the Balkans by NATO, you know. That's where it just goes out the window. You know, we believe in democracy and human rights, except when the regimes that we support are suppressing those things. And the Palestinians are the most betrayed people on the planet, maybe in history. And they've been betrayed by everyone. And it's not my place primarily to criticize Arab societies and Arab governments, but they sure could be stepping up a lot more than they are.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of betrayal in that history, you know, and that's going to have to be reckoned with inside the Arab world. But yeah, it's very selective. Humanity is selective, democracy is selective, universal human rights are selective. And we're seeing how power works in it's the most brutal, stark, jaw-droppingly simple demonstration of how power actually functions in this world. And it remains to be seen what conclusions we'll draw from it. There's many points from which we won't return in this one, I think. But yeah, we're seeing something very, very disheartening about how much power we really have over the decisions of our so-called leaders.
Okay, so recently we have witnessed the self-immolation of Arun Bushnell, who made a strong statement about the genocide. Aaron's statement is very powerful in portraying the trauma of genocide witnesses and the feeling of helplessness that comes with it, especially for those who are part of the power system feeding the genocide. Some opinions labeled Aaron as mentally ill. I am interested to hear your opinion on this matter and how it is related to trauma.
Well, I'm not qualified to label or diagnose anyone as mentally ill. You know, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a doctor, and I didn't know Aaron. So I don't know, he could have been mentally ill. He might not have been, who cares? It's a total non sequitur. Because, and here's to come back to the myth of normal, I said that to be normal in this society is to be, in many ways, dead on the inside and deeply out of whack with your own nature and deeply inauthentic. Well, one thing you can't say about Aaron Bushnell is that he was not in touch with his own gut feelings, or that he wasn't making an authentic choice. Now, we don't have to glorify or venerate self-immolation. I mean, it's a horrendous act. Whether you want to call it heroism or something else, it's a stunning thing to do. I don't know what his life was like before. I haven't read enough about his mental state. His statements sure sounded cogent to me. They sounded like sane, considered, rational statements. And actually self-immolation has a pretty noble history. You know, there were even cases of it that I forget where it was. Was it Libya or Morocco or
Tunisia.
Tunisia? Okay, so there was a shopkeeper or something who lit himself on fire, and you can go back and see Obama in his, you know, dulcet scholarly tones talking about, you know, there are certain times when people have to make a bold statement and make the ultimate sacrifice for the values they believe in, and it's tribute to, you know. There was no discussion of was that Tunisian street vendor mentally ill? You know? So again, it's selective. We have concern about mental illness when it's, you know, selective. Now, the topic of mental illness does come up in the case of school shooters and serial killers and things like that. Well, you read their statements and they're insane.
Yeah.
At the same time, insane is a judgment. And inside that person's world, it made sense. So what is that world? That's the question. What is the world inside which doing something like that would make sense? Well, it's a world of pain. It's a world of trauma. So if Aaron Bushnell was traumatized, I'm sure he was a traumatized person. He was sensitized to the pain of others. He had to learn that somehow. I just don't see the relevance. But I do think there was moral clarity in what he did, and I think moral courage in what he did. And yeah, but it's just it's very distasteful. I think the use of the sort of concern trolling about mental illness as a way of just not looking at why this young man did what he did, what he was trying to direct our attention to, what he died for.
To what extent does the focus on trauma undermine the agency of the people subject to it? For example, a Palestinian professor in psychology, Lina Miari, challenged the notion of trauma as depicted by mostly Western and Israeli academics of the Palestinian experience in Israeli prisons. She proposes that the exclusive focus on trauma frames Palestinians as passive beings with no agency for resistance and resilience. What are your thoughts about that?
I don't really get that line of argument. And it sounds a little bit like, and I'm not accusing her of this, but the thing that comes to mind is you could have a Zionist saying the focus on Palestinian trauma takes away their agency. Well, They're responsible for voting for Hamas. They're responsible for supporting the October 7th attacks. They could have responded to the occupation differently, so on and so forth. You know, I don't know what this professor means when you say we take away their agency. We didn't take away their agency. The occupation took away their agency. What does agency mean? Having a positive attitude? A can-do, you know, sort of I can overcome anything, like being plucky? Like a child character in a musical, you know, like agency. And not to mention, trauma does take away our agency. It doesn't necessarily take away our responsibility if we have the material freedom to make choices, which the people in Gaza do not. But it actually disables the parts of the brain, the orbital frontal cortex, the impulse regulation centers that are responsible for exercising our agency. So agency is only theoretical until you actually have the wherewithal to exercise it. So when I'm, you know, when my partner is triggering me, or when I'm triggered by my partner, rather, because she's not doing anything, she's just saying blah, 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 and I get triggered, and I start reacting the exact same way that I reacted when my parents used to upset me or oppress me or whatever they did when I was a kid, you know? and I start acting like that 5-year-old, how much agency do I have in that moment? The Myth of Normal starts with a story of my dad returning from Philadelphia on a speaking trip, feeling all good about himself, you know, having been upgraded to business class, and feeling great, and he lands, and he's excited to tell my mom about it, and he texts her, or he lands, he turns on his phone, and there's a text from her, sorry, I lost track of time, I'm not going to be able to pick you up from the airport, you're going to have to take a cab. And he spends the next 2 days in a cold rage. I got to write that part, it was fun. That was my favorite part of the book, writing stories about my dad being a prick in his voice, putting words in his mouth. But he was only being a prick on the surface. On the inside, he was being a little boy. He was actually being a little infant whose mother abandoned him, or didn't abandon him, but in his world abandoned him, handed him to a stranger on the streets of Budapest. Why? To save his life. But he was a baby. He couldn't understand that. All he knew was she was giving him away. She was gone. And that gets triggered in his nervous system. How much agency does he have in that moment? Well, one would hope that with enough repeated experience of these kinds of things, one starts to wake up and say, oh, I don't want to behave that way. That's the agency. The space to be able to look at it some distance and say, oh, that's not actually the way I want to live my life. Now let me find other ways to support my nervous system in those moments, things like that. Well, if you have privilege, you can do that. If you're in Gaza, you can't. So agency isn't just something that everyone has the same amount of. And by acknowledging, I'm just trying to understand the logic, if I acknowledge that Palestinians are carrying enormous amounts of trauma in their nervous systems, as they are, I don't know if you guys saw, there's an American, it sounds like he's Texan or Southern or something, he lives in Egypt, and he's working directly with Palestinians who have been evacuated. What's that? Quinn, is that his name? That sounds right.
Quinn the Eskimo, isn't it?
Quinn the Eskimo, yeah, right. Great Bob Dylan song. He talks about how these people, the trauma starts to show its face once they get to Egypt. All of a sudden they can't sleep, they can't eat, they can't do simple things. The nervous systems have been banged around so much, and now they're trying to readjust. You know, it's kind of like how many of the deaths from starvation happen during refeeding, right? That's what happens to a traumatized body. Well, is he taking away their agency? Or is he naming the thing that took away their agency and trying to work with them slowly and compassionately to give their agency back to them? So I just have to understand more about what the substance of that critique is. I think sometimes there can be this desire to not infantilize people or to not to speak about them in ways that take away our hope for their resistance. The two don't, it's got nothing to do with each other. You can acknowledge that people are traumatized and that they're living, like what's the essence of an occupation is to take away everyone's agency. Now Primo Levi, of course, wrote about in Man's Search for Meaning, no, that's Viktor Frankl, sorry, but you know, both of those guys wrote about life in a concentration camp and that the only agency they had was ultimately over their own spirit, really, their own point of view, which is also a lesson I learned in my mini concentration camp experience in a Mexican jail.
So similar.
It's so similar, and we should always be comparing everything. But I did, you know, and so you can always, people can, again, but just like it's not my place to tell anyone how to talk about their trauma, everyone's relationship to their own agency is there. I'm not taking away anyone's agency by saying, wow, you've been through some shit, you know? Because you have. And I would understand if that's had an impact on your relationship with the world and with yourself.
Yeah, and I think the same applies to the Israeli army and the even in the US, like after invading Iraq and they come back, the soldiers they say we are traumatized, but okay, that doesn't take away what you've done, what you inflicted on people. You are still responsible for their misery.
I mean, in a sense, that's true. And in a sense, soldiers who are following orders have already had their agency taken away from them. That's called basic training. The point of basic training is to traumatize a person's sense of self to the point where they can't make decisions for themselves. Now, we can decide what kind of legal system we want to have. Do we still punish soldiers who carried out evil orders? Maybe. I'm not saying we shouldn't. Mm-hmm. But, you know, it's a tricky thing. And it's the sensitive ones who are going to have PTSD. Many of them will actually be able to live with it. And that's the scary part.
Yeah.
Because they were already desensitized to their own pain and to other people's pain from birth. But I understand the anger in your question, you know? It's like, are we going to let these people get off the hook just because they're traumatized? No. But like I said about that novel, understanding the trauma, and if you just look, you watch any of the videos of these people blocking the aid convoys, I think all those people should be locked up, you know? I think all those people should be locked up and put away in some kind of international rehabilitation center. If they refuse to be rehabilitated, they should never see the light of day again. That's how I feel right now. That's an emotional response. It's not a legal argument. It's just how I feel, you know? And if you're to look in their eyes and listen to their voices, you see deeply damaged human beings.
Yeah.
Human beings are not born that way. You know? They are taught that the world is a scary, hostile place where they have to be cruel. And this is why it's like, for me, the ultimate test is, can I have compassion for the Nazis who carried out the Holocaust? And actually, yes, I can. Even the ones who killed my great-grandparents. Would I hesitate to see them punished? Probably not. I don't know. But there are victims of, you know, families of victims of mass murder or whatever who managed to have compassion for the people who killed their people. So I don't know. Again, it's not my place to dictate to you or to anyone else that you should sympathize with Israeli trauma, but acknowledging it doesn't take away your right to be angry and doesn't take away your right to justice. Just because they're traumatized doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to stop them, you know. And it was like when I had that debate with that Israeli soldier, which I can't believe I did, back in November. I'm not saying I shouldn't have done it, I just can't believe I did it. And he was calling me his brother, and the Palestinians are his cousins, and this and that. And yeah, I said in my next video, a few days later, I said, I realized, okay, you're my brother. Well, if you're my brother, I've got to stop you from killing our cousins. I can have all the love in the world for you, but I will fucking get in the way and stop you from doing this if I can. Because my love for you, my compassion for you, there's something higher than that. And I think that's the thing. We can acknowledge people's trauma, but we don't let that trump our solidarity with the oppressed, our values, the kind of world we want to live in. And yeah, so just because I have compassion for Germans in World War II doesn't mean I'm not glad that that country got smashed to bits. And I'm not talking about Dresden here, but you know what I'm saying.
Okay, so this will be our last question.
And it's a really tough thing to talk about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like even as I'm talking about it, I have no idea if I even believe what I'm saying. I could say it a number of different ways. It's hard. It's hard, and we're all struggling with this, you know.
It might be a simple but a popular question. Aside from the people subject to the genocide in Palestine and Gaza, do witnesses exaggerate when they claim to be traumatized? Does this undermine actual experience of trauma?
Who are you talking about?
About witnesses. All
What?
of us, we are witnessing the live stream.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I don't know. I don't know. I'm not sure what to say about that, actually. Maybe some do. I guess the incentive to be hyperbolic would be for more clicks. We are living in a click economy, you know? But I'm not seeing... Most people's sense of trauma rings true for me. And the fact is, and again, I'm going to put Palestinians anywhere in the world in their own category, because you are not just witnessing it, you are going through it. You are not sitting idly by from a privileged position and like, you have skin in the game. This is your people being decimated and destroyed on purpose, according to a plan that's been there for a long time. And the whole world is letting it happen. So I would never tell you that you're exaggerating anything. Now, I do see things that I would be tempted to call exaggerations happening on the other side. Hyperbolic, histrionic, overdramatic, almost campy. There's a kind of camp to Zionist trauma in this moment. And it's being churned out through a massive Hasbara industry, you know, that's so odious and so sometimes laughable that I sometimes co-host a podcast dedicated to making fun of it. And that is just disgusting, you know, I mean, it's just revolting. And so it's easy to look over there and say, okay, I'm sure subjectively you're feeling afraid, but you have the absolute wrong interpretation of where that fear is coming from and what you should be doing about it, you know? As far as people who are actually bearing witness to this, everyone's going to react in their own way. And I don't think one person's trauma takes away from anyone else's trauma. I am even tired of the word trauma, quite frankly. I'm tired of it. I'm just tired of it. And I make royalties off it, and I'm tired of it. You know, like any of these pop psychological terms, any of these terms, once they enter pop psychology, and it becomes this, I mean, do you know what my life is like? I'm scrolling through Instagram, and the algorithm decides that every 5 posts, I'm supposed to see Trauma Super Conference featuring Gabor, Matè. Ah, it's my trauma. And it gets kind of cheap, doesn't it? It gets kind of shabby, you know? It's not him, it's not his fault that there's an industry that's cropped up around this. And thank God he's doing the work he's doing for all kinds of reasons. But it's like, people are hurting, people are wounded, people are injured. They have the right to call that whatever they want it. And in this moment, with what we're witnessing, how can people not be walking around with real injuries right now. I just don't see the point in. I mean, just like I'm tired of trauma, I'm tired of questioning people's trauma too. Let's just let it be, you know, and try to actually meet people where they're at and find out what they're dealing with. And people are dealing with a lot right now, and they should. I mean, it's just the only way it can be right now in this moment. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.